Most importantly, what theme music would you like?
Theme music.
Yeah,
Oh, geez, I didn't even
your
think
intro
of this.
music.
It'd be good to have something related to anger, or maybe something really calming. Kind of.
Baba Yetu.
Yeah, just have Baba Yetu going around in the background. That is not a song about getting angry.
Okay, I am delighted to introduce my good friend Robert Wallace. Robert is currently a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Arizona. He is moments away from finishing his doctoral dissertation, and he will be starting next semester as an assistant professor in philosophy at California Polytechnic in San Luis Obispo. So, Robert, thank you for joining.
Thank you for asking me to do this.
No, of course. So the reason I wanted to talk with you is, more than anyone else I know, you're someone who takes the moral importance of emotions really seriously. So a central part of your philosophical framework is that emotions communicate morally important things. How do they do that?
That's a good question. I guess just as some background. So I got into thinking about the moral emotions actually through the free will problem. So a lot of people think that free will is whatever kind of control you need to be morally responsible for what you do. But there's this huge literature on what it is to actually hold one another morally responsible. And a lot of people think that, like to blame somebody is just to get angry at them in a particular way. And so that's how I kind of got into all of this. And to blame somebody is, in a way, to communicate that you think that they've done something wrong. And I think this actually fits in really well with the Srinivasan stuff. When you blame somebody, I think you resent them, and that's a way of having a form of moral anger, which communicates that you think that they violated a moral norm. Right? I think emotions do that in a couple of different ways. I mean, one way that emotions can communicate these sorts of, communicate to somebody that they've done something wrong is through culturally mediated expressions. So, for instance, if I'm feeling romantic towards my wife and I get her some flowers, she understands that those flowers are an expression of some way that I'm feeling. Right? I'm trying to communicate to her that I'm feeling a particular way. So there are, of course, sort of symbolic gestures. But I think at the basic level, empirical psychology seems to suggest that there are things like basic emotions, like being afraid. And those are just sort of, we understand when somebody looks afraid, like children understand that they're afraid, that they're having a certain kind of attitude towards something out in the world. And so I think they can communicate basically by being outward expressions of internal states.
Another way that we communicate outward expressions of internal states is just to use our words. So what is it that emotions add to language?
I think one of the things, so in preparation for this, I reread what I assume is your student's homework, the Aptness of Anger. And I really like the way that she puts it in terms of appreciation. So I can communicate using words that I appreciate something. But the interesting thing about having an emotional expression is that it can be like a direct expression of my appreciation, right? So, in fact, actually, the farther you get away, maybe from basic, like if you see the joy on my face, right? That's an immediate communicative entity in a way. You understand that I appreciate it. It's very hard to fake that, right? The further you move away from that, like, if you give somebody flowers, it's possible that I could be, not actually signaling genuine appreciation, right? And words are powerful tools, but words are also, I think, you might think they're not always reliable symbols in the way that reliable sort of communications signals than a basic emotional expression is. It's very hard to fake genuine grief, right? It's easy to, I think, say things in certain ways. So obviously, like language can do things that emotional expression can't. But I think if we're thinking about emotions as a way of showing our appreciation for things that are important, they have a special role to play.
going into the analogy about appreciating art and appreciating the beauty of art in the same way, the thought supposed to be something like you can say to your wife, "I'm really grateful for what you did," and that communicates something. But there's a more impactful way of communicating that, which is namely to kind of show your gratitude in an emotional form through your expressions, through how you feel, and all the normal ways that we communicate emotion.
Yeah, I think more than not even it being more impactful. It's like when you see genuine joy on somebody's face, you don't have to make any inference about whether or not they're actually experiencing joy. They're not actually appreciating something as being good in the way that joy is an appropriate response to. Um, it's harder, I think, in the case of just sort of using our words. I mean, not all of us are, I don't know. So, for instance, in the case of anger, not all of us are as wonderfully gifted as Baldwin in being able to express our anger. So, part of it, I think, is just the directness of the communication. Part of it too is that we think that having these emotions. I think this is sort of the pop view, right? The Stoics would be so angry about what I'm about to say, but I think just feeling those emotions are a way of responding and showing a kind of deeper understanding of the value or disvalue that the emotions are responses to. So being able to sort of all in one go communicate to other people that we are actually really understanding what's going on, I think is extremely powerful inside of morality and sort of outside, just ordinary personal relationships, the kind of involved relationships where we think these emotions are appropriate.
That must be pretty provocative if you're getting the Stoics angry. Try not to do that.
I mean, angry in the way that, they would form a rational belief that what I was saying was false, and maybe they would express themselves to me as an emotional being, as someone who's not undergone the Stoic exercises, in a way that would get me to respond appropriately to reason.
So I think this leads nicely into a point that Srinivasan makes. So she thinks that there's a kind of pervasive error in a lot of Western thinking that the emotions are non-rational, and to respond rationally means not to respond emotionally. But
Yeah.
what you're saying is that emotions communicate all these things. Do you think that that's tied into how it is that she thinks the emotions are rational, and do you think they're in the same kind of way?
Yeah. So we actually both agree that emotions can be rational, although we disagree about the particulars for why. On her view, as I understand it, emotions are essentially evaluations, and we can use our reason to check whether or not we're evaluating a thing appropriately, right? So an emotion is a response to the world that casts the world in a certain light. So, for instance, fear, you might think, represents something as worth being afraid of, and then along with that will come all kinds of responses to it, right? Whether or not it's rational for me to respond to my fear in particular ways depends on whether or not the fear itself is like an apt or appropriate or veridical representation, right? If I'm terrified of oranges, you might say, well, that's irrational because the evaluation, oranges are worthy of being afraid of, just isn't true. So I think her view is something like, look, anger can be apt and therefore, in some sense, rational, insofar as we could actually be responding to moral wrong in the world, right? That could actually, our anger could be representing the world the way it is. And in fact, a lot of the authors that she cites in that article bring up this point that emotional responses can be a way of actually learning about the world, right? They represent the world in a particular way. Now, she and I disagree about something, and that's that emotions also have a cognitive component. So she thinks that emotions are not essentially judgment involving, right? So it's not that you make a judgment that something is, worthy of being afraid. It's just how your emotions are representing the world. I happen to be a cognitivist about emotions. I think that emotions do involve judgments or are responses to judgments. Or maybe minimally, they have what you might call propositional content. They represent that something is a way. And in that sense, I think that they can be maybe rational in a stronger sense. So they're not rational just in the sense that we can evaluate them rationally and check to see whether or not they're appropriate or inappropriate. They might actually be just internal to themselves, rational or irrational.
Nice. So it seems like there's a point of agreement here. So the Stoics distinguish between emotions, which always have that propositional content, and moods. They'll say things like, "Does it make sense to ask someone what they're depressed at. Sometimes it's just depressed, it's just a mood. Whereas when you were sad that something happened.
Yeah.
So one way the Stoics subject the emotions to a kind of rational scrutiny is they ask whether or not getting emotional will make the situation better or worse. And one of the big arguments is that anger tends to cloud your ability to reason, and that's going to make you make worse decisions in the future. Now, Srinivasan wants to argue that sometimes it's good to feel fitting emotions or apt emotions, even when they make situations harder. Why would we do that? Why would it be a good thing, like intrinsically, to get angry, even though it makes the situation worse, or it might make the situation worse?
Yeah, so a big part of her argument has to do with the fact that experience and emotion is a way of appreciating a value, where appreciation is supposed to be more than just merely knowing it. Right? And so she uses this analogy with aesthetic appreciation. So I could know that something is beautiful, but that's different than actually like appreciating that it's really beautiful and having a certain kind of response to it. And we can think about emotions in a similar way. So even if it's counterproductive, it's going to have bad consequences for me to like really appreciate something via an emotional response. There's something valuable, I think, just about that mode of understanding, that kind of appreciation. I think there are other reasons too. I mean, one thing that a lot of people have talked about are the ways that having emotions can be epistemically valuable, not even insofar as they allow us to appreciate things, but rather that they shift our attention to salient features of the environment. Right. So if I get angry about something, it might be true that I'm going to be resistant to certain kinds of rational persuasion in the heat of anger. But that I am angry might actually focus my attention on, say, certain kinds of injustices that would be hard for me to appreciate from a more sort of cool-headed point of view. I think one of the interesting things about Srinivasan's article is precisely this idea that there are cases where we can have bad consequences in the appropriateness or consequences and appropriateness come apart when it comes to our feeling emotions. So it could be that an oppressed person feels appropriate anger at an injustice, and this might be a way of understanding that injustice in a way that's deeper than merely knowing propositionally that things are bad for me because I'm such and such. Actually having that experience can be valuable, even if feeling that emotion could have bad consequences. I think it's totally right to think that that's a kind of injustice, because it's basically a way of denying a person the ability to experience and understand in this particularly good way.
Do you think that you can learn from other people's emotions as well? So if I'm angry, it might draw my attention to something about the situation that I hadn't fully thought through. But do you think that seeing other people's anger is also has that kind of impact?
Yeah, I think it can in two ways. So one way I think has to do with third party feelings. So I think it's a really interesting thing about emotional beings like ourselves is that we can come in some ways to embody or experience the feelings of other people, right? Especially when it comes to our loved ones or close personal friends. But even in more abstract cases, if you see somebody that's grieving, you yourself might start to feel grief, even if you don't even have any particular ties to what's going on. So one of the interesting things about emotions is that they're kind of catchy. Uh, and you can think that there's, I think a good background explanation of this is that it turns out it's really helpful if you have a sort of system built into you that helps you focus your attention on really important things in your environment, that you be able to share that information with others. The other thing too is like, even if um, even if you can't experience that emotion, right? So like a lot of people think, for instance, it would be very hard for somebody like me to understand exactly what's going on to an oppressed person. So even if I can't fully understand and appreciate the anger of an oppressed person, when they express it to me, they can point out the salient things that are happening to them that I might not be able to appreciate or understand. And even if that's maybe not quite as good or different than actually appreciating it firsthand or first personally, it can still direct my attention to that injustice. Or in other kinds of cases, right? If somebody's afraid, it can direct my attention to the things that are genuinely fear-worthy about what that person is afraid of. And I think that can be really helpful just for getting people to understand things. In the moral case, I think it's really important for basically getting people moral knowledge.
One of the things which is really strange about the Stoic account is they don't seem to recognize this kind of third person emotions that you're talking about. So they think that you're angry when you have a belief that you have been harmed. and that it would be good for you to take revenge. Whereas
Yeah.
a case like that isn't going to work if you're thinking about someone oppressing someone else. It seems, even if you're unconnected to it, they seem to think that emotions always have this kind of first personal aspect. You think this is just a defect in the theory, or are they getting at something there?
Yeah. Spoiler alert to your students. Jeremy, Professor Reed, let me see the questions beforehand. So I had some time to think about this one, and I have two. I'm not sure which is right. So here are two different ways of answering the question. The first way of answering the question says something like this. The Stoics think that emotions essentially bottom out in beliefs. And there's something we might say indexical about beliefs. I can only believe things for myself. I can't believe things for you or anybody else. So you might think that what's going on here in terms of the Stoic account of emotion being sort of unable to handle feeling things on behalf of others is because their account essentially doesn't have the resources to countenance it. They have to explain all emotions in terms of beliefs, but beliefs aren't like emotions in this way. Again, I can't believe something that you do just because you believe it. I can't, that's not how beliefs work. It's a different kind of way of engaging with the world. So that's one kind of response. The other kind of response is to cede to the Stoics that actually they're kind of right. There's a way in which, I can't feel your anger. I feel my own anger. I just might feel it on your behalf. And there are cases where we can see that come out. So a good friend of mine, Rosalind Chaplin, has a paper about third-party blame. So getting angry on somebody else's behalf, and she has this, I think, a really compelling case. Imagine that you've gone through a really bad breakup, and you've kind of gotten over it, but your best friend hasn't, and they're just so angry at your ex, and they continue to be for like a long time, like way past when it would be appropriate for you to still be angry, and yet they're still angry about it. Oftentimes we take this to be like a sign of good friendship, actually, that your friends have like continued to show that they're on your side. They appreciate the wrong that was done to you. We can just say it was a bad breakup. And their continued anger is in a way like supportive of the friendship. So maybe there's something right about the Stoic account that actually, everyone's anger is different, right? I think maybe the flaw then is not that they have a hard time explaining how they've latched onto something correct. I guess this sort of response says, but they fail to appreciate the way that even if all of our emotions are essentially self-involving in a certain way, their objects can be really importantly related to other people, right? Like I can be angry at the injustice of another person, injustice done to another person. And that's a perfectly fitting and appropriate target of my anger, even if, the anger is still somehow located in me in an essentially indexical way. So I'm not sure which way to go there. I'm sort of torn, but those are my two best cracks at answering this question.
Isn't your wife still really angry at one of my exes who I've gotten over?
Yeah.
She's a good friend.
Yeah, no, I think this is an interesting thing. I think about third-party emotional cases is that, and again, this goes back to the sort of communicative value. The continued anger of a friend over something wrong that happened to you is a way of them appreciating that a bad thing happened to you. And it's a way of signaling that they really care about you, right? Like they're being unwilling to let it go is a way of manifesting care.
Does this tie into why you think it is that emotions and getting emotional, especially in moral situations, is a way of showing respect to other people?
Yeah. I think it's first of all easier to do it in sort of the and not all emotions are like this, right? Like if I'm really afraid, I'm not showing self-respect, right? But I think anger is importantly related to respect, particularly moral anger, because moral anger is tied to sort of responding to moral wrong in the world, right? So when I get angry at somebody because they've done something wrong to me, I'm essentially saying, hey, like it's worth caring about the fact that I was harmed. Look, see my caring. I'm all worked up about it, right? And so in a third person case, if you get upset about a wrong that's done to somebody else, that's a way of saying like, hey, I care. I'm having this sort of focused, attentive, caring attitude towards the fact that that person is wrong, and that's a way of basically signaling, manifesting the fact that they ought to be respected, right? So one reason I think for thinking that it's like good for us to be angry and we should be angry politically, and maybe broader is it's a way of signaling that in across all sorts of domains we ought to be respected. There aren't places where our cares and concerns can be minimized or sort of shut down. And I think actually Srinivasan's article does a good job of explaining why affective injustice is particularly pernicious then, right? Because if there are certain situations where I'm not allowed to express my anger, that's basically a way of saying you're not allowed to express your care or concern for this thing in this domain.
Do you think that justification about self-respect and all the stuff we've been saying about the kind of communicative function of the emotions is a way to kind of justify how it is that protests can actually be really politically powerful, even if it looks like they don't directly result in legislation, that they can be important communicative symbols?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think just in general, one of the reasons why thinking about the emotions seriously hasn't been taken up in analytic philosophy until somewhat more recently has to do with a sort of general disregard for symbolic value. So I think when we ordinarily kind of go through the world, symbols are really important. Symbols are ways of motivating us. They're ways of communicating things to other people. They're ways of drawing our attention to things that purportedly matter or maybe don't. And I think one of the powerful things about emotions is that they do have this sort of symbolic value. By getting angry about something that's happening, even on the other side of the world, I can sort of symbolically stand with the people who are being wronged and against the people who are the wrongdoers, even if there's nothing I can actually do. Now, of course, like it would be better if I could actually do something, right? I think emotions aren't just symbolically important. I mean, we are creatures of the passions. Our emotions are important for motivating us towards doing things. So being angry at injustice could actually motivate people to do more than simply protest against injustice. But in a sort of big interconnected world where it's not always obvious how exactly my actions are going to impact other people or how I can actually do things, cases where my getting angry or protesting isn't going to have directly good consequences, it's still a way of standing with people and against wrong. And that in and of itself, I think, is important. And again, like I think it's always tricky here when we say, well, maybe protests won't have a direct impact on legislation or public policy, but it might have a direct impact on other things. I mean, again, I think this maybe goes back to the catchiness of feelings. I do think feelings, emotions in general, have an important role to play in our motivational system. And so if I go to a protest and I hold up a sign or whatever, and somebody sees the sign that I've held up on the other side of the world, let's say over the internet, they might have the feeling too, and they might be in a position to actually do something about something that I can't. So I think another reason why at a political level or a moral level more generally, protesting things that are bad, I tend to think that people downplay the effectiveness of these sorts of things. Even if, we're not going to see immediate results, there's something important about motivating other people that I think protests can have an especially important role to play there.
Wonderful, Robert. I always love talking with you. I always learn so much. So thank you for your time. I'm sure my students will really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun. I hope your students have a good time thinking about all this stuff. I think it's important to think about. So thanks again.